She sits in the California sunlight, 70 years old, her famous giggle nowhere to be found. The woman who once made America laugh until their sides ached now carries a quietness that speaks louder than any punchline ever could. Her hands, once animated in 1,000 talk show appearances, rest still in her lap. The golden curls that bounce through a generation's worth of romantic comedies have silvered, and behind those bright blue eyes that sparkled on Laugh-In lies something deeper. The weight of a life lived entirely in public, the exhaustion of carrying other people's joy while her own remained just out of reach. The Pacific Palisades home around her tells the story of a woman who survived Hollywood's golden machinery. Emmy awards catch dust on forgotten shelves. Framed photos from red carpets seem like artifacts from another lifetime. The phone that once rang constantly with offers, interviews, and invitations sits silent. This is what victory looks like when the war is finally over. Not triumph, but peace. This is Goldie Hawn in 2015 at 70, finally allowing herself to be still. No cameras rolling for a new film. No red carpets demanding that infectious smile. Just a woman who spent 5 decades being everyone's favorite ray of sunshine, now learning what it means to simply exist without performing happiness for the world. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. To a middle-class suburb where a little girl first learned that her laughter could save her. This is the story of what happens when your greatest gift becomes your greatest prison. Goldie Hawn gave us laughter, gave us light, gave us the permission to be silly and joyful and unguarded. But behind that giggle was a woman fighting battles most of us never knew existed. Anxiety so severe it nearly destroyed her career before it began. The suffocating pressure of always being on, and the impossible choice between authenticity and survival in an industry that loved her image but never quite knew what to do with her depth. Her journey reveals the hidden cost of being America's sweetheart, the price of fame that no one warns you about, and the courage it takes to remain human when the world wants you to be a symbol. It's about a woman who spent decades making others happy while forgetting how to make herself whole. If this story moves you, tap like so others can find it. Because Goldie's journey reminds us that even our brightest stars can struggle to find their own light. November 21st, 1945, Tacoma Park, Maryland. A baby girl enters the world to Laura and Rutt Hawn, and something about her seems to radiate light from the very beginning. But light, as Goldie would learn, casts shadows too. The Hawn household was middle-class American in every way. Rutt worked as a band leader and musician, his trumpet filling their modest home with jazz standards and big band melodies. Laura ran a jewelry shop and dance studio, her own dreams of performing, channeled into teaching the next generation. Music filled their home, but so did pressure. In the suburbs of Washington, D.C., appearances mattered. Perfection was expected, and little Goldie, with her wild blonde curls and boundless energy, learned early that when she made people smile, everything felt safer. The family dynamics were complex in ways that would shape her forever. Rutt, charming and talented, battled his own demons with alcohol, a struggle that taught young Goldie to read moods instantly, to know when to be vivacious and when to disappear. Laura, ambitious and sharp, poured her unfulfilled artistic dreams into her daughter's potential, seeing in Goldie's natural charisma the success she'd never achieved herself. She was 3 when she first stepped onto a dance floor at her mother's studio. The other children watched as this tiny tornado spun and leaped with abandon, but what they couldn't see was the careful calculation already forming in her young mind. When I move like this, they clap. When I laugh like this, they love me. When I'm this version of myself, everything is okay. The studio became both sanctuary and prison. Here, surrounded by mirrors and ballet bars, Goldie learned to split herself in 2. The performer who could command attention, and the anxious child who desperately needed approval. She watched herself in those mirrors for hours, perfecting not just her technique but her expressions, learning which smiles were most infectious, which laughs were most disarming. By age 10, she was performing professionally, tap dancing and ballet taking her across the region to competitions and recitals. But success came with a price that no child should pay. The spotlight was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Standing under those hot stage lights, sweat beading on her young face, Goldie learned to read a room instantly, which jokes landed, which expressions earned the biggest applause, which version of herself was most lovable. She became an expert at being what others needed her to be, even as she quietly wondered who she was when no one was watching. The other children at school began to see her differently. She wasn't just Goldie anymore. She was Goldie the performer. Goldie the one who was different, special, set apart. Friendships became complicated when you're the girl who's always traveling to competitions, always missing parties because of rehearsals, always being pointed out as the one who's going to be famous someday. High school brought new challenges and deeper wounds. While her classmates worried about prom dates and college applications, Goldie was already working semi-professionally, her income helping support her family during Rut's difficult periods. The other kids saw the glamorous performer, but they couldn't see the exhaustion that came from living two lives, the bubbly entertainer and the anxious teenager who lay awake at night wondering if she was good enough, smart enough, enough. It was during these years that the first cracks in her seemingly perfect facade began to show. Panic attacks would strike without warning, her heart racing, her breath catching, her mind spiraling into chaos during quiet moments when the performance mask slipped. But the show, as they say, must go on. So she learned to swallow her fear, to smile through the terror, to transform anxiety into energy that could power a performance. The pressure at home intensified as college loomed. Laura pushed for more competitions, more performances, more opportunities to showcase her daughter's talent. But each success brought new expectations, new standards to meet, new ways to fall short of perfection. Goldie began to understand that her family's stability depended partly on her ability to perform, to succeed, to be the bright spot in their increasingly complicated lives. She graduated from Montgomery Blair High School in 1963, but while her classmates headed off to college dormitories and football games, Goldie was already plotting her escape to New York City. The decision created the first major rift with her mother, who wanted her daughter to have the stability of education. But Goldie felt the pull of something bigger, something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. At 18, she packed everything she owned into 2 suitcases and boarded a Greyhound bus to Manhattan with $200 in her pocket and a dream that felt both thrilling and terrifying. As the bus pulled away from everything she'd ever known, Goldie pressed her face to the window and watched Maryland disappear, not knowing she was leaving behind the last moment in her life when she would be truly anonymous. New York in 1963 was brutal for young performers, and Goldie learned this lesson within days of her arrival. The city that had seemed so glamorous from afar revealed itself as a grinding machine that chewed up hopeful kids from small towns and spat out broken dreams. She took classes at the American University while auditioning for anything that would pay. Chorus lines, commercial work, even dancing in nightclubs where men with wandering eyes and bourbon breath made her skin crawl. Her first apartment was a studio in Hell's Kitchen that she shared with 2 other aspiring performers. The walls were thin, the heat unreliable, and the cockroaches plentiful, but it was hers. Every morning she'd study the casting notices in Variety, circling possibilities with a red pen, mapping out her day around audition schedules and dance classes. The rejections came fast and often. Too blonde for this role, not blonde enough for that one. Too wholesome for the gritty parts, too earthy for the princess roles. Directors would take one look at her and see only the surface, the pretty face, the bouncing curls, the infectious giggle, never bothering to discover what lay beneath. But Goldie was learning, absorbing everything. She watched other performers, studied what worked and what didn't, slowly began to understand that talent alone wasn't enough in this city. You needed resilience, luck, and the ability to smile through rejection after rejection after rejection. The break came in 1967, but not the way she'd imagined. Laugh-In was NBC's revolutionary new comedy variety show, and they needed dancers who could also do comedy. It was the kind of opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true, a chance to perform for millions of people, to be part of something groundbreaking and exciting. Goldie auditioned with hundreds of other hopeful performers, but something about her combination of innocent sexuality and genuine goofiness caught the producer's attention. She wasn't trying to be funny in the traditional sense. She was just authentically herself, and that self happened to be naturally hilarious. What happened next would change everything. On January 22, 1968, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In premiered, and America fell instantly in love with the dizzy blonde who giggled her way through news segments, stumbled over words, and seemed to be having more fun than anyone had ever had on television before. The show was revolutionary in ways that went beyond comedy. It tackled political topics, pushed boundaries, and featured a cast that reflected the changing face of America. And at the center of it all was Goldie, delivering one-liners with perfect timing while somehow maintaining an aura of innocent confusion that made even her most pointed jokes feel harmless. But the giggle that made her famous was also becoming her trap. Behind the scenes, Goldie was sharp, intelligent, deeply thoughtful about comedy and timing. She studied the great performers, Carol Burnett, Lucille Ball, Buster Keaton, understood the mechanics of humor, and approached each sketch with the precision of a surgeon. Yet the public saw only the bubbly character she played, and Hollywood began to see only that character too. The success was intoxicating and overwhelming. Fan mail poured in by the thousands. She couldn't walk down the street without being recognized, couldn't go to a restaurant without strangers approaching her table. The privacy she'd taken for granted disappeared overnight, replaced by a goldfish bowl existence where every move was scrutinized, every outfit dissected, every relationship analyzed. By 1969, just 2 years after her breakthrough, Goldie was offered her first major film role in Cactus Flower. Working opposite Walter Matthau and Ingrid Bergman, she had to prove she was more than just a television novelty. The pressure was immense. If she failed, she'd be written off as another TV performer who couldn't make the transition to films. The character of Toni was perfect for her, a free-spirited young woman caught up in a complicated romantic situation. But Goldie brought layers to the role that surprised everyone, including herself. She wasn't just playing another dizzy blonde. She was revealing the heart and vulnerability that lived beneath, the laughter. She didn't fail. She soared. Her performance was both hilarious and heartbreaking, showing a depth that surprised critics and audiences alike. The reviews were glowing, the box office strong, and suddenly Hollywood was paying attention to Goldie Hawn in a whole new way. When the Academy Award nominations were announced, there was her name, Best Supporting Actress. The girl from Maryland who'd arrived in New York with 2 suitcases was now nominated for the industry's highest honor. On April 7, 1970, at just 24 years old, Goldie Hawn walked across the stage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion and accepted her Oscar, tears streaming down her face as she thanked everyone who'd believed in her. But even in her moment of greatest triumph, the shadows were lengthening. The industry that had just honored her was already trying to put her back in her box. Studio executives saw dollar signs in her bubbly persona and began offering her role after role as variations on the same dizzy blonde character. She wanted to stretch, to show her range, to prove she could be more than America's giggling sweetheart. But every time she tried to break free, the box got smaller. The 1970s brought a string of successful films. There's a Girl in My Soup with Peter Sellers, Butterflies Are Free with Edward Albert, The Sugarland Express directed by young Steven Spielberg, but also a growing sense of being trapped by her own success. She was making millions. Her name was above the title. Fans adored her, but she felt like she was disappearing inside the character everyone expected her to play. The Spielberg collaboration was particularly frustrating. Here was a brilliant director who saw her potential, who cast her in a dramatic role that required real acting chops. But even in this more serious film, the marketing focused on her looks, her charm, her ability to make audiences smile. The deeper work she was doing seemed invisible to everyone but the director and her fellow actors. Then came the personal costs. Her marriage to Gus Draconis, a dancer and choreographer she'd met during her early New York days, began to crumble under the pressure of her rapidly rising career. The man she'd married when she was nobody couldn't handle being married to America's sweetheart. Their divorce in 1976 was her first real taste of how fame could poison even the most intimate relationships. But if the end of her first marriage was painful, what came next would be devastating. She fell in love with Bill Hudson, the charming musician from the Hudson Brothers Band. He was handsome, talented, and seemed to understand the entertainment industry in ways that Gus never had. They married in 1976, and for a brief moment it seemed like she'd found someone who could handle her fame, who could love both the public Goldie and the private woman behind the giggle. Their children, Oliver and Kate, brought her the deepest joy she'd ever known. Finally, here were people who needed the real her, not the performance. She could be silly with them not because it was expected, but because it was natural. She could be vulnerable, tired, human. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't have to be on every moment. But fame is a jealous lover, and it doesn't easily share. Bill Hudson struggled with being known primarily as Goldie Hawn's husband. The press scrutinized every aspect of their relationship, analyzing their body language at premieres, speculating about their private conversations, turning every public appearance into a referendum on their marriage. Paparazzi followed them everywhere. turning simple family moments into public spectacles. The pressure mounted, resentments grew, and by 1980, that marriage too was over. The divorce was messy and public, with tabloids painting her as the dizzy blonde who couldn't hold on to a man, suggesting that maybe the giggling sweetheart wasn't so sweet after all. The woman who had brought joy to millions was now a cautionary tale about fame's ability to destroy love. It was 1980, and Goldie Hawn was at the height of her commercial success when the bottom fell out. The end of her marriage to Bill Hudson wasn't just a personal failure, it was a public humiliation played out in supermarket tabloids and late-night talk show monologues. The same media that had built her up now seemed to take perverse pleasure in tearing her down. The custody battle was particularly brutal. Private conversations became court documents, intimate family moments were dissected by lawyers, and her children, Oliver, just 4, and Kate, barely 1, became pawns in a game that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with revenge and money. But the real devastation was private, hidden behind the smile she still had to wear for public appearances. For the first time in her career, the anxiety she'd managed to keep at bay for over a decade came roaring back with a vengeance. Panic attacks returned nightly, sometimes multiple times, leaving her gasping for breath in her empty mansion while her children slept in the next room. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't summon the energy to perform the happiness everyone expected from her. The woman who had built her career on spontaneous joy found herself mechanically going through the motions, her laughter hollow, her smiles painted on like stage makeup. She was 35 years old, a single mother of 2 young children, and America's funny girl was no longer funny, even to herself. The woman who had built her career on joy had forgotten how to find it in her own life. The giggle that had opened every door now felt like a lie she was too tired to tell. The early 1980s should have been Goldie's creative prime, but instead they became her wilderness years. She turned down role after role, unable to summon the enthusiasm to pretend to be happy for the cameras when she could barely get through each day. The few films she did make, seems like Old Times with Chevy Chase, Best Friends with Burt Reynolds, felt mechanical, as if she was going through the motions of being Goldie Hawn rather than actually being her. On set, she was professional but distant. The spontaneous joy that had once made her such a delight to work with was gone, replaced by a careful competence that got the job done but lacked the spark that had made her special. Directors who had specifically requested her began to wonder if they'd made a mistake. The panic attacks grew worse. Some days she couldn't leave her Pacific Palisades home, the Spanish-style mansion that should have been her sanctuary, but instead felt like a beautiful prison. The woman who had once thrived on the energy of live audiences now found crowds terrifying. Even simple errands became monumental challenges when every trip outside meant potential recognition, questions, expectations of cheerfulness she simply couldn't meet. Her daily routine became a careful dance around her limitations. She'd wait until late at night to go grocery shopping, hoping to avoid recognition. She'd wear dark glasses and baseball caps, trying to become invisible in a city where she'd once been the brightest star. The simple pleasure of anonymity that most people took for granted had been stolen from her, leaving her trapped in her own success. Her children became her lifeline and her biggest source of guilt. Oliver and Kate needed their mother, but they were getting a shell of the woman who had once filled their home with laughter. She tried to maintain normalcy for them, bedtime stories, birthday parties, school events, but children see everything. They watched their vibrant mother shrink inward, watched the light dim in her eyes, even as she tried to keep sparkling for the world. The loneliness was crushing in ways that no amount of money or fame could fix. Hollywood friends melted away when she was no longer the life of every party. Fair-weather relationships revealed their true nature when the weather turned stormy. She discovered that many people had loved Goldie Hawn the character, but few knew or cared about the person underneath. Industry parties became torture. She'd arrive with her smile firmly in place, work the room with practiced charm, make all the right sounds about upcoming projects and future plans. But inside, she felt like a fraud, a broken toy still playing its programmed responses long after the batteries had died. The insomnia was perhaps the worst part. Night after night she'd lie in her king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with anxiety and regret. What if she'd chosen differently? What if she'd said no to fame when it first knocked on her door? What if she'd stayed in Maryland, married a normal man, lived a normal life? There were dark nights when she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake, if she'd traded her authentic self for fame and fortune and lost both in the process. The Oscar on her mantle felt like it. belonged to someone else, a bright memory from a different lifetime. The woman who had won it seemed like a character she'd played once, long ago, before she'd learned what the spotlight could cost. Financial pressures added another layer of stress. Divorce settlements, child support, and the cost of maintaining her lifestyle meant she couldn't afford to be as selective as she wanted to be. She had to work, had to keep the machine running, even when every cell in her body was screaming for rest. But even in her darkest moments, she held on to one thing. Her children needed her to survive. Not to perform, not to be on, but simply to be present, to be real, to be enough exactly as she was. It was a revolutionary concept for someone who'd spent her entire adult life believing her worth was tied to other people's laughter. Recovery was slow and private. She began therapy with a psychiatrist who specialized in anxiety disorders, slowly learning that her struggles weren't a sign of weakness but a natural response to unnatural pressures. She started practicing meditation, initially skeptical but gradually discovering that the very mind that tormented her could also be her greatest ally. Most importantly, she began to understand that the giggle that had made her famous wasn't fake. It was just one part of who she was. She could be joyful and anxious, lighthearted and deeply serious, silly and profound. The box Hollywood wanted to put her in was too small for the full spectrum of her humanity. In 1983, at 38, Goldie met Kurt Russell on the set of Swing Shift. The film itself would be largely forgotten, but the relationship that bloomed during its production would become one of Hollywood's most enduring love stories. Kurt was different from the other men she'd known, established in his own right as an action star and dramatic actor, comfortable with her success, uninterested in changing her or competing with her fame. More importantly, he seemed to see and love both versions of her, the public performer who could command a room's attention and the private woman who sometimes couldn't get out of bed. Their first date was supposed to be dinner, but they ended up talking until sunrise, sharing stories about their childhoods, their fears, their dreams for the future. Kurt had been a child actor himself, starting at Disney, so he understood the unique pressures of growing up in the entertainment industry. He'd navigated the transition from child star to adult actor without losing his sanity or his humanity, and he became a guide for Goldie in ways she'd never expected to need. Their relationship became a testament to the possibility of authentic love in an industry built on artifice. They never married, partly because Goldie had learned that legal contracts couldn't protect love, and partly because their commitment ran deeper than paper could document. They chose each other every day for over 40 years through career ups and downs, family, crises, and the constant pressures of public life. The 1990s brought a creative renaissance that surprised even Goldie herself. Films like Death Becomes Her allowed her to explore darker themes while still honoring her gift for comedy. Working alongside Meryl Streep and Bruce Willis, she created a character who was vain, desperate, and utterly human. Not the sweet ingenue of her earlier films, but a complex woman grappling with aging and irrelevance in a culture obsessed with youth. The First Wives Club was even more revelatory. Here was a film about women taking control of their own narratives, refusing to be discarded when they became inconvenient to the men who had once loved them. Goldie's character wasn't just seeking revenge, she was seeking wholeness, trying to reclaim the parts of herself she'd lost in bad relationships and worse compromises. These roles allowed her to process her own experiences in a safe, creative space. She wasn't just the giggling blonde anymore. She was a woman commenting on vanity, aging, betrayal, survival. Her laughter had gained wisdom. Her comedy had found its edge. The audience that had grown up with her was aging too, and they recognized something real in her newer performances. But perhaps her most meaningful work happened off-screen. In 2003, she founded Mind Up, a program designed to help children understand their own brains and emotions. Drawing from her own struggles with anxiety and mental health, she created curriculum that taught kids the tools she wished she'd had at their age: how to breathe through panic, how to find calm in chaos, how to understand that difficult emotions are temporary and survivable. The program was based on neuroscience and mindfulness, revolutionary concepts in education at the time. Goldie had become an unlikely expert on brain function and child development, spending years studying with researchers and therapists to understand how young minds work and how they can be supported. Working with children became a form of healing. These young minds didn't know her as America's sweetheart or the giggling blonde or the Oscar winner. They knew her simply as the lady who taught them that their brains were amazing, that their feelings mattered, that they were enough exactly as they were. In teaching them, she finally learned to teach herself. The foundation work took her around the world, from inner-city schools in Los Angeles to refugee camps in Southeast Asia. She discovered that the skills she'd developed as a performer, reading a room, connecting with strangers, communicating complex ideas simply, translated perfectly to education and advocacy. As she entered her 60s, Goldie made peace with stepping away from the spotlight. The industry that had once worshipped her youth now seemed unsure what to do with her aging. Roles for women over 50 were scarce, and those that existed often reduced complex women to stereotypes: the bitter ex-wife, the dotty grandmother, the cougar chasing younger men. Rather than fight for roles that weren't written for her or submit to the indignity of pretending to be younger than she was, she chose to create her own meaning. She wrote books about her experiences with mindfulness and mothering, expanded her foundation work, became a grandmother who could be fully present because she was no longer performing for an audience of millions. The woman who had once been terrified of not being enough discovered that she had always been more than enough. The anxiety that had nearly destroyed her career became the source of her empathy. The sensitivity that made her vulnerable also made her wise. The struggles that had seemed like failures became the foundation of her later success as an advocate and teacher. At 70, Goldie Hawn sits in that California sunlight, and the quietness isn't empty. It's full of hard-won wisdom, full of authentic relationships, full of the knowledge that she survived the machine that consumes so many others. The same hands that once trembled with anxiety now teach children how to calm their own racing hearts. The same mind that once tormented her with panic now creates programs that help others find peace. She learned to be human in an industry that preferred her as a commodity, learned to age gracefully in a culture obsessed with youth, learned to find joy that didn't depend on other people's laughter. The mansion in Pacific Palisades is quiet now, but it's the peaceful quiet of someone who has nothing left to prove, nothing left to perform. Her tragedy isn't that she lost her career, or her beauty, or her relevance. Her tragedy is simpler and more universal. She spent decades believing that her worth depended on her ability to make others happy, forgetting that her own happiness mattered too. But perhaps that's not tragedy at all. Perhaps it's transformation, the slow and painful process of becoming whole. The giggle is still there when she needs it, but now it comes from a deeper place, not from the desperate need to be loved, but from the quiet confidence of someone who finally loves herself. Not from the fear of being too much, but from the joy of being exactly enough. Not from performance, but from presence. If you enjoyed this journey into one of Hollywood's most beloved and misunderstood figures, please like this video so others can discover it too. And here's my question for you. Which moment in Goldie's story resonated most deeply? Was it her early struggles with anxiety, her fight to break free from typecasting, or her ultimate discovery that she was always enough exactly as she was? Sometimes our greatest victories come not from conquering our struggles, but from learning to dance with them. Sometimes the most profound joy comes not from making others laugh, but from finally allowing ourselves to cry.